Grey Hollow was the kind of place people passed through without ever planning to stay. The valley sat quietly between forested hills, wrapped in a constant stillness that made the town feel older than the maps claimed it was. Weathered houses lined the narrow streets, and an abandoned railway cut across the edge of town like a forgotten scar in the earth. At the far end of those rusted tracks stood Blackridge Tunnel, a massive stone opening carved into the hillside long before anyone living there had been born. No trains had passed through it for decades, yet the tunnel remained exactly as it always had been, dark, silent, and strangely avoided. The residents of Grey Hollow never spoke about it directly, but their silence carried its own meaning. Whenever newcomers asked about the tunnel, conversation stopped, eyes shifted, and someone eventually changed the subject. It was almost as if the town had silently agreed that ignoring the place was safer than trying to explain it. But curiosity doesn't fade easily for someone who has never learned to fear stories. When Evan Calder arrived in Grey Hollow for a short surveying project, he quickly noticed how everyone reacted whenever the tunnel was mentioned. The more people avoided it, the more it stood out in his mind. To him, Blackridge Tunnel was simply an old railway passage, abandoned and forgotten like hundreds of others across the countryside. Yet the tension in the town suggested something more. And the deeper Evan looked into the quiet habits of Grey Hollow, the clearer it became that the tunnel wasn't just another ruin. It was something the town had learned not to disturb. In the days that followed, Evan began noticing how often the tunnel appeared in the distance during his work across the valley. From the hills where he measured landmarkers and old property boundaries, he could see the stone arch resting quietly beneath the trees, always darker than the surrounding forest, like a doorway that swallowed light instead of reflecting it. It looked completely ordinary from afar, yet the uneasiness surrounding it continued to linger in the town's atmosphere. Eventually Evan decided to ask about it directly. Inside the small diner that served as Grey Hollow's main gathering place, he brought up the tunnel casually during conversation. The response was immediate. Lila Mercer, the diner's owner, paused mid-sentence as if the name itself carried weight. Marcus Hale, a mechanic who had lived in Grey Hollow his entire life, simply stared for a moment before shaking his head slowly. Neither of them offered a dramatic story or frightening explanation. Instead, Marcus spoke in the calm tone of someone repeating a warning that had existed long before him. He explained that people used to walk through the tunnel years ago when the railway closed, but those attempts rarely ended the way travelers expected. Some returned confused, claiming the passage inside felt longer than it should have been. Others said the tunnel distorted sound, making footsteps echo in strange patterns. Over time the town stopped trying to understand it altogether. They simply avoided it. But for Evan, those warnings had the opposite effect. The lack of answers didn't discourage him, it made the mystery impossible to ignore. A few evenings later, Evan stood at the edge of the abandoned railway path with a flashlight in his hand and the entrance to Blackridge Tunnel rising before him. Up close, the structure looked enormous, its stone blocks darkened by years of rain and shadow. Weeds had swallowed the rusted rails leading inside, and the forest surrounding the entrance seemed strangely quiet. As if even the wind avoided passing through the opening. Evan hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. The moment he crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped slightly, and the outside sounds of the forest disappeared behind him. Inside, the beam of his flashlight cut through thick darkness, revealing damp stone walls and the faint outline of old railway tracks stretching deeper into the mountain. At first the tunnel behaved exactly as expected. Water dripped slowly from cracks in the ceiling, and the echo of Evan's footsteps bounced gently along the curved walls. But as he walked farther in, those echoes began to sound different. Sometimes the sound returned half a second too late. Other times it seemed as though there were two sets of footsteps instead of one. Evan stopped walking to listen, and for a brief moment the tunnel fell perfectly silent. Then, just as he started moving again, the faintest echo followed behind him, as if the tunnel itself had taken one extra step. The deeper Evan moved into the passage, the more the tunnel seemed to behave in ways that didn't quite match its appearance. The stone walls were still solid and unbroken, yet the sense of distance began to feel distorted. Sometimes the tunnel appeared narrower than before, forcing Evan to brush his shoulder against the damp rock. A few moments later it seemed to widen again, though he had clearly continued walking in a straight line. When he turned to look behind him, the entrance had already disappeared into darkness much sooner than expected. Even stranger was the way sound behaved inside the tunnel. Dripping water echoed endlessly, but the direction of the sound seemed to shift each time he paused to listen. Evan tried to keep his focus steady, reminding himself that underground passages could easily confuse a person's sense of direction. Yet the longer he walked, the more it felt as though the tunnel itself was subtly rearranging the space around him. Then his flashlight beam revealed something unexpected resting on the rail beside the wall. It was an old lantern, its metal frame worn but intact. Inside it, a small flame burned quietly, casting a soft glow against the stone. Evan picked it up slowly, realizing that someone, or something, had left it there. And in the silence of the tunnel, the presence of that single burning lantern made the darkness feel far less empty than it had before. Holding the lantern in one hand and the flashlight in the other, Evan continued forward with growing caution. The warm glow of the flame revealed details the narrow beam of the flashlight had missed before. Along the stone walls, faint carvings appeared in scattered patterns, symbols scratched deep into the rock by tools or knives. Some looked like arrows pointing backward along the tunnel, while others resembled rough warnings left by travelers who had clearly struggled to find their way out. As Evan studied them more closely, he realized that many of the markings overlapped each other, as if different people had returned over the years to add new directions beside the old ones. The lantern's glow flickered softly, casting long shadows across the carved symbols. Then Evan noticed something moving along the edge of that light. A tall shape briefly appeared near the far wall, standing perfectly still. For a moment it looked unmistakably like a human figure. But when Evan turned the flashlight toward it, the shape vanished instantly, leaving only the blank stone surface behind. The tunnel returned to silence, yet the feeling remained that the darkness around him was no longer empty. Something inside Blackridge Tunnel had been quietly observing him all along. Eventually the tunnel widened into a broken chamber where the railway tracks disappeared beneath a pile of collapsed stone. This was likely the collapse Marcus had described years earlier, but the damage looked far older than the town's stories suggested. The lantern's glow illuminated the walls beyond the rubble, revealing a massive circular carving etched directly into the rock. The pattern was far too precise to be random. It formed a complex ring of lines and shapes that resembled an ancient seal rather than a railway marking. Evan stepped closer, running his fingers across the grooves carved deep into the stone. As he studied the design, the whispers of sound within the tunnel began returning again, soft echoes drifting through the chamber like distant voices carried by the wind. Suddenly the meaning of the carvings became clear. The circular pattern wasn't meant to open something or lock something away. It was meant to guide travelers away from this exact place. Long before the railway existed, someone had discovered that the rock beneath the mountain distorted sound and space in strange ways. When the tunnel was carved through the hillside generations later, that hidden chamber had been exposed again. And the markings left behind by travelers were not decoration, they were desperate attempts to understand a place where direction and distance could not be trusted. Realizing this, Evan turned around and began retracing his steps through the passage. The lantern flame flickered violently for a moment before calming again, and the strange echoes that had followed him earlier slowly faded into silence. Step by step, the tunnel seemed to behave normally once more. Eventually, after what felt far longer than the walk-in, a faint grey light appeared ahead. When Evan finally stepped back outside into the open air, the quiet valley looked exactly as it had before. The forest rustled gently in the wind, and the abandoned railway stretched across the landscape as if nothing unusual had ever happened there. Later that day, Evan returned to the diner and shared what he had discovered inside Blackridge Tunnel. Marcus listened carefully without interrupting, his expression thoughtful but not surprised. When Evan finished explaining the carvings and the strange chamber beneath the mountain, Marcus simply nodded slowly. The mechanic looked toward the distant hills where the tunnel lay hidden behind the trees and spoke in the calm voice of someone who had always suspected the truth might be stranger than any rumor. Some places, he said quietly, don't need to be haunted to be dangerous. Sometimes the land itself carries secrets that people were never meant to disturb. And even though Evan had walked through Blackridge Tunnel once and returned safely, the dark entrance still waited silently at the edge of Grey Hollow, unchanged, unexplained, and just as unsettling as ever.